than Euler. 700 years ago, the bubonic plague, also known as the Black Death, swept through Europe, leaving half the population dead. In this program, we're going to look at what it was really like living in the Middle Ages through the artwork of the people who were alive at the time. The bubonic plague is caused by the bacterium Yersinia pestis. This bacterium is carried by fleas, specifically a species of flea that feeds on the blood of rodents, not just rats, but rodents such as marmots and squirrels and other animals as well. When an infected flea bites a human, that human can also become infected. The bubonic plague is a very, very serious disease. It can take 3 forms, or it can progress rapidly through 3 distinct stages, each stage more deadly than the one before. Stage 1 is characterized by high fever, vomiting, and the development of painfully swollen lymph glands that form pus-filled boils called buboes, hence the name bubonic plague. Although terrible, this stage is not always fatal, and sufferers, even in the Middle Ages, were known to recover. The second form, or stage 2, is called septicemic plague because it causes bacteria to infect the blood, causing sepsis, commonly known as blood poisoning. Septicemic plague was always fatal in the Middle Ages due to multiple organ failure. It produces brain inflammation resulting in delirium, as well as bleeding and hemorrhaging under the skin. Blood clots also form in the extremities, blocking blood flow to the fingers, toes, nose, and ears. This causes the tissues to die, resulting in necrosis and gangrene. Since the dead tissue turns black, the disease became known as the Black Death. The third stage is known as pneumonic plague, which infects the lungs. Even today, people who develop pneumonic plague always die. And pneumonic plague can occur all on its own, suddenly affecting seemingly healthy people, causing them to literally drop dead in the street. This happened so frequently during the Middle Ages that the Italian writer Giovanni Boccaccio, who lived through the pandemic, famously observed that people ate lunch with their friends and dinner with their ancestors in paradise. The Black Death first infected Europeans in 1346, although rumors of a mysterious disease killing people in the Far East and along the trade routes such as the Silk Road had been circulating for several years. The Mongol invasion of Europe, which had occurred a century earlier in the 1220s, was ultimately responsible for the Black Death being carried west. In 1346, a fight broke out in the city of Tana on the Black Sea between Italian merchants from Genoa and a group of Mongols. The Italians fled to their fortified outpost at Kaffa. The Mongols followed, laying siege to the city. The siege of Kaffa lasted a year, until the Mongol troops began falling ill with plague. Before retreating, the Mongols, never once for sentiment, took their revenge on the Italians by catapulting dead Mongol soldiers over the city walls, thus infecting the Genoese with plague. In May 1347, survivors from the siege of Kaffa began boarding ships to make their escape back home. One ship docked in Constantinople, infecting the city. Over the next several years, 90% of the population of Constantinople died of the plague. Another ship from Kaffa docked in Sicily at the port of Messina, the crew barely alive. Although port authorities blocked the crew from entering the city, the damage had already been done. Messina also was badly infected, causing the panicked residents to flee to the Italian mainland, thus spreading the plague further. By the following summer, an estimated 1/3 of the population of Italy had died. Similar scenarios occurred all over Europe until by the end of the year 1348, only 2 years since the siege of Kaffa, most of the European continent was infected. Now you may be thinking that if medieval Europeans hadn't been such uneducated, dirty louts living in squalor and spending their time killing witches, they might have taken steps to avoid the plague. Well, this characterization of medieval behavior is a complete myth. If you doubt that, consider the level of architectural, engineering, and artistic skill it took to erect the medieval cathedrals. No, Europeans were neither uneducated nor stupid. However, due in part to the prevalence of the Christian concept that science somehow went against God's will, medieval Europeans' knowledge and practice of medicine did lag behind their skills and knowledge in things like architecture. Nonetheless, they still knew a lot about how to prevent the spread of disease, if not necessarily how to cure it. They realized that it was a very bad idea to come in contact with sick people because you were likely to catch the disease. And they knew that disease spread through the air, although they didn't understand why or how. They thought disease traveled through the air as a miasma, a bad-smelling vapor or cloud. They actually weren't far wrong, because sickness and death do create bad smells. But it's not the smell, but the germs, bacteria, and viruses floating in the air that spread disease. Medieval people had no concept of this. Even so, when the Black Death struck, they closed ports and city gates to travelers and isolated sick people by confining them in their homes or in specially constructed buildings called pest houses or pestilence houses. And they burned the clothes and bedding of people who died, because they also realized that disease could be spread through objects and on surfaces. Italy took a leadership role in this. In fact, the word quarantine is Italian, quarantino, meaning a 40-day period of isolation. Although a quarantine doesn't have to be 40 days, it can be longer or shorter, depending on circumstances. In 1348, Venice was the first city to impose citywide plague restrictions, closing down taverns, ordering ship inspections, and burning those found to be infected. They also banned wine from unknown suppliers and enacted laws on how to safely dispose of the dead. But no one in medieval Europe used masks, gowns, or gloves as a preventative measure against plague. The famous image of the plague doctor is from a later outbreak of the Black Death, which occurred during the 17th century, just so you know. But despite all the precautions, the odds were stacked against them. Northern Europe had only barely recovered from the Great Famine of 1315-1322, which had left many regions and a number of people in a weakened condition. Also, some people refused or could not follow mandates or take precautions because they needed to continue making a living. And then there were the realities of living in medieval cities. Medieval cities may look nice in paintings, but the reality was far different. Cities were crowded, filthy, and unhealthy, even under the best of circumstances, with no indoor plumbing or running water and open drains running down the center of the streets. And what were those drains used for? To dispose of all sorts of garbage, including human waste. It's true. It was a common practice, at least in some northern European countries such as Scotland and England, to throw the contents of chamber pots into the street with a warning of "Gardy Loo." This practice continued in Edinburgh, Scotland, until well into the 18th century, as this drawing illustrates. Combine all the human waste with all the animal waste, rotting fish, meat, and vegetables from the markets and slaughterhouses, and who knows what else, and you had a perfect breeding ground for disease. Then there was the practice of burying people only for a few years in church graveyards, then digging them up and storing the only partially decomposed body and bones in a charnel house. Talk about miasma and bad smells. This is what's happening in the gravedigger scene from Hamlet. Alas, poor York, I knew him well, Horatio. During the Black Death, this practice changed. Plague victims were buried in deep mass graves known as plague pits, stacked in layers like cheese in a lasagna, according to Boccaccio, and they never dug them up, fearing renewed infection. Archaeologists run across plague pits all the time. As the plague dragged on, people grew more and more irrational and began to blame others. The rich, the government, witches of course, and many blamed the Jews. Thus an anti-Semitic rage spread through Europe, resulting in massacres and many thousands of Jewish deaths. Anti-Semitism was encouraged by a cult of Christian religious zealots originating in Germany, known as the Flagellus. The Flagellants believed that by beating themselves bloody with whips, they could turn God's wrath away from their fellow citizens and bring an end to the plague. They marched from town to town, drawing huge crowds and gaining thousands of new followers. They also spread the plague everywhere they went. Then there was the non-stop drinking and partying. Many argued that since they were about to die anyway, why not have a good time while they still could? Some held weird parties in graveyards and charnel houses called a dance macabre, or dance of death, in which they dared the Grim Reaper to come and take them. I expect alcohol was involved. In 1351, the spread of the plague suddenly slowed down and then disappeared almost entirely, at least on a pandemic level. No one knows why, but it left up to 50 million people dead in Europe alone, half the population, leaving society in a state of chaos, with rampant inflation and social and economic systems such as feudalism that no longer worked. However, new ideas soon began to take hold, and new leaders emerged. Only 50 years later, in the year 1400, when some who had survived the Black Death were certainly still alive, the Italian Renaissance began, paving the way to the modern age. What a 10-minute professor. This is Dr. Susan Ray Euler. Thanks for tuning in.